Hello, my name is Nina. Welcome to my channel, Inside the Mind of a Human Predator. On December 11th, 2017, an attractive woman in her mid-20s was delivered to a suburban hospital outside of Moscow, Russia. She had suffered traumatic injuries. Both of her hands were missing. However, this was not an accident. She had been attacked by an axe in the woods. This sounds like a very graphic intro to a horror movie. Unfortunately, it's a real life story of one of the worst cases of domestic violence in the case of divorce at the hands of the soon-to-be ex-husband that I think most people can even imagine. Because there had been a lot of media coverage of this case, I'd like to look at the facts in more details first, and second, look at the mental health and personality of the perpetrator. Now I'd like to have a look at the facts of the case, but before I do so, I wanted to point out that Margarita Gracheva's story was a personal inspiration to me in a certain way, because when the media first started covering it broadly in Russia in December 2017, I was going through my own, let's call it, escape to freedom. And my own story has many awful and unique aspects, unlike other stories. However, seeing something that is so extreme, so unthinkable, so horrifying, really brought me back into reality, made me count my blessings. Looking at this beautiful woman in a hospital bed like a ray of light, so cheerful, looking forward to reuniting with her children, to living, to continuing to live, to being alive, was extremely powerful. And that is the attitude she has maintained in public. And I believe that is her personality, very resilient, very optimistic, very cheerful. And I think that she was and is an inspiration to many other individuals in domestically abusive or violent situations.
Я боец, я говорю, я не буду сдаваться, я буду бороться до последнего. Я могу каждым пальцем пошевелить.
So now let's have a look in more detail at the facts of Margarita Gracheva's case, and I will refer to her as Rita by her short name. The couple, Rita and Dmitry, had been married for approximately 5 years at the time of this horrific attack. They had 2 children, 2 boys of preschool daycare age at this time. And we know statistically, in terms of domestic violence, the time around planning to leave, if the abuser is aware that this is happening, leaving, and right after is the most dangerous time for the target of abuse, which is exactly what happened in this case. So it's not quite clear as to the reasons that led to their separation and the initiation of divorce proceedings. But Margarita makes various comments about the cooling down of the relationship, and I believe that things were pretty significant for someone to consider divorce beyond the typical day-to-day tensions of married life, these stresses of raising two young children while working, etc., etc. She had made comments about the escalating jealousy that was baseless on the part of her husband at the time, Dmitry. She talked about finishing her maternity leave and returning to work. So here she is, having lost the baby weight, and she's doing very well professionally. However, instead of complimenting her, and I assume there was some kind of a financial incentive too for her making more money, which of course would help a young family, he would be very critical and he would denigrate her for being successful. So here we see a case of envy, not just jealousy. At the same time, Dmitry was very jealous of any possible man that Rita would come in contact with in a public space, whether at work or elsewhere. Throughout this whole media coverage, I don't think I've seen a name of a particular love interest So that just tells you the extent to which her then husband was unhinged. He was basically jealous about the possibility of another man looking at his wife. So the way this situation was escalating, he would display these rages against inanimate objects. So he would come home, he would go into the bathroom, and he would dump all her shampoo bottles, hair product bottles into the sink, and then he would put them back because, God forbid, her hair is shiny. I mean, it's really excessive, obviously, on so many different levels. And as this was happening, they were essentially still living in the same residence, the same apartment with the two children, but they were living like roommates. There was not a lot of interaction. And it was pretty clear where things were going, although at that time Rita had not announced her plans to file for divorce yet. So here they are sharing parenting, and Dmitry is essentially completely ignoring her, like she does not exist, according to her public statements. And she had also written, unpublished a book co-authored with her mom in 2019, where she goes into more detail about the situation. So to me, this translates into the silent treatment that is sometimes associated with people who have certain narcissistic traits, and we will look at that in more detail a little bit later. So as this is happening, he realizes that the silent treatment is not working in terms of getting that emotional reaction that he so desires from Rita. Once again, to me, this screams narcissistic supply. So he changes his tactics and he actually becomes more aggressive. He was really treating her as an object at this time. He would search what she was wearing in terms of her bra and underwear. And if the set was matching, he would make the assumption that she's going to meet up with her mythical lover that did not exist. So once again, the level of paranoia is quite remarkable, because what if the two were not matching? Does that mean the potential, cheating would not occur? I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. So this is the kind of searches that this woman had to go through. So there is a definite escalation from first aggression towards inanimate objects, then the silent treatment that did not work, then now she's literally physically being searched as to what she's wearing underneath her clothes. And she is becoming more and more concerned about her safety at this time. She basically announces to Dmitry that she is going to file for divorce. That sends him into a violent rage, and Rita says in the media that this is the first time where he really truly physically assaulted her. So she was assaulted, and she, at around this time, sort of early fall of 2017, late summer, she asked him to move out, because this was a very terrifying escalation to her. He actually had done so, but he had taken the family car. This made it very difficult for her to transport the two young children to the daycare where they were going. There was decent public transportation in her town. However, it would have taken her multiple buses to deliver the children to the daycare, then go to work. And so this was quite problematic to her. Using a cab with car seats that are going in and out twice a day, is anyone who's done it knows that it's pretty much impossible in terms of scheduling to do so. So nonetheless, she really is doing a good job at this time of staying away from someone who had now not only shown aggression towards inanimate objects and all kinds of verbal and abusive behavior and really intense jealousy and envy that is baseless, but who had now progressed into physical violence. As this is happening on November 10th of 2017, Margarita, based on her statements in the media, is getting ready to leave, and Dmitry shows up and drags her into this family vehicle, locks the door, and drives her into the woods, at which point he threatens her at knife point. Eventually, the incident de-escalates. She doesn't specify how she's able to leave, and she does not have any bodily injuries. However, she's very proactive, unlike so many targets of abuse and domestic violence that feel too ashamed to contact not just the police, but even their own family members and social circle. Of course, in many cases, they're isolated by the abuser, the human predator at this point. And the shame that the abuser who denigrates them for anything and everything is internalized. So she is very different. She's very proactive. She contacts the police. She attempts to file a police report. The police takes its time to even pursue this incident. So more than 2 weeks later, they follow up, they interview both parties. It ends up being this he said, she said situation, even though she was practically kidnapped, and the police does not pursue this at all. Later on, as this case after the awful attack had gained a lot of media coverage, there was an investigation launched of that particular police officer because there was not enough done in terms of pursuing this initial incident. However, it's very easy to see that in many cases, not just Russia, where it's an awful and stressful and aggressive situation that does not lead to bodily harm, how there's not as much that could be done, or if it's done, let's say there is a jail sentence or a very short prison sentence, the person gets out, and if they're very determined, it doesn't matter if there are restraining orders in place and whatnot, they may proceed further, even if the target does everything right. And in the case of Rita, it seems that she was very, very much on point and actually proactive in terms of securing her safety. So after this incident, she becomes very much more concerned, even though she was concerned prior to this incident, this kidnapping at knife point. She has a schedule of when she checks in with her mom daily, mornings and evenings. She informs her colleagues of the situation, very proactive. She gives them the license plate of Dmitri's vehicle, the family vehicle. She tells them that if one of these days she does not arrive at work at 9 a.m., they have to contact the police because something bad could possibly happen at the hands of her soon-to-be ex-husband. So everyone in her immediate social circle is very, very well aware of this escalating danger. So again, in that sense, she's very different from a typical target of abuse where there is a lot of concealment and shame and not reporting things to the police. So she really, truly is doing everything that she possibly could. So there are two results coming out of this November 10th, 2017 kidnapping. One, because the police does not proceed with the investigation, Dmitry has this increased sense of power and getting away with whatever he wants to do. And later on, it becomes clear that he had awful plans pretty early on. The second consequence is the fact that there is a sudden, rapid change in attitude and behavior on the part of Dmitry. He becomes cordial, he becomes polite, he becomes helpful. To an outside observer, this is a massive, massive red flag. Changes like this are gradual if they're authentic. There cannot be something that is rapid. It should be a huge red flag. But for a person who is inside of that situation, a person who had married this individual, who had children with him, Rita was obviously very hopeful that they could become decent co-parents who are cooperating in raising their two young children even after the divorce. So she read it in a very optimistic way. Sam Vaknin would call this malignant optimism. But she cannot be faulted for this because who could have possibly imagined that what was coming a month later was actually coming. So in that time period, so less than a month prior to the final attack in December 2017, Dmitry becomes very helpful with driving the children to and from the daycare, taking Rita to work. So even though he had taken the family vehicle, he's helping her out in this many ways. And here comes the fateful day of December 11th. At this time, Rita is planning to go on a family trip with her mom and the two boys to another town. So she has packed suitcases. That morning, Dmitry picks her up, picks up the children, everything is fine. He takes them to the daycare. They stop by the mom's house first thing in the morning. They pick up a suitcase, and Dmitry says, "Do not put the suitcase in the trunk, put it in the back." Later on, Rita realized that what was in the trunk was the axe and the two rubber bands, tourniquets, that he had used to restrain her and to prevent blood flow as he was torturing and butchering her in the woods. So as she is in the car and the children had been dropped off, mom is out of the picture, no witnesses, he, instead of taking her to work as promised, he takes her into the woods the second time, and this is when the attack occurs. I'm not a nurse or a doctor. It's very difficult to read the medical details. They make me dizzy, so I won't go into too much detail, and I can't imagine how it is to actually be present at something that is so unthinkable. So the torture takes approximately 40 minutes or so, according to the target of it. I'm not sure how well she could estimate it. And he restrains her, and he uses these tourniquets that would be used in, the medical field for blood testing or blood donations. So these rubber bands to restrain her, to prevent blood flow, basically to keep her conscious and alive. So the level of premeditation we'll talk about in a little bit more detail when we talk about mental health and personality. And he is very open about telling her that he has researched this. Later in the car, as he's taking her to the hospital, she tells him that she cannot feel her wrist or her hands, and he says, "It's okay. You can have these tourniquets on for up to an hour and a half," which tells you that he had really been looking into this question. She says that she was conscious the entire time as this torture had occurred in the woods, that he seemed to be really enjoying it. One of the hands that was later located had multiple fractures and injuries. So there were at least 10 blows, at least, of the axe carried out by this human predator. And in the initial interviews, Rita said that one of the comments he supposedly made was that now these hands will never touch another man. So this is along the lines of the level of cruelty of, if I can't have you, no one can, except he obviously wanted her to suffer for the rest of her life, to be alive, and he damaged her appearance. In that sense, it's more sinister. It's kind of akin to chemical attacks. And we know that there's so much pressure on women to look a certain way, and he goes ahead and he not only makes her disabled, and he damages her appearance, her sense of self, etc., etc. So once the torture is over, he puts her in the car and he rushes her to the hospital. She reports that while he's driving, he's screaming, quote, "What an adrenaline rush." I mean, I have no words for this other than the level of sadism and what appears to be enjoyment is unfathomable. He takes her to the hospital. The doctors take over. This is in suburban Serpukhov, where she's from. And then he turns himself into the police. And he knows that turning himself in would actually cut down on his eventual prison sentence. So he calculated all of this. They go back into the woods, and approximately 5 hours after the incident, the entire incident took approximately an hour and a half, they locate one of her hands, her left hand. And luckily, as crazy as it sounds to use this word, it was approximately 0 degrees Celsius, December, Russia, so approximately 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And that preserved the hand just enough to be able to attempt to reattach it. The other one was not found. So after approximately 5 hour surgery to basically prevent blood loss and keep her alive in her suburban town, she is transferred to a top clinic in Moscow where at least a 10-hour surgery occurs, reattaching this found hand. So the doctors in that sense performed some kind of a miracle considering the time frame and the type of injuries that had occurred. And now many months and 3 years later, the hand is functional, but it only has sort of basic functions, putting things into the grocery bag, flipping pages of a book. So Rita lacks fine motor functions she says she cannot handwrite. She has trouble pinning up her hair and, buttoning buttons, sort of things that everyone usually takes for granted. And she has a prosthetic arm on the other side. People with disabilities in Russia get state-funded prosthetics, but of course they're not top-level bionic stuff that you can get. So they fundraised at the time, I think it was 6 million rubles. And she has this arm that her children had called when they were very young at that time, "Oh, Mom was a cool Terminator." So she's able to control it with her mind, so to speak, but of course the functionality of what she had as a healthy human being versus this is very limited. It's, very responsive to temperature changes, cannot touch water, etc., etc. So that's where her rehabilitation is at now. In terms of the criminal case, there were a number of charges in terms of the criminal case. So 2 counts of kidnapping, attempted murder, and causing grievous serious bodily harm. At the same time, there was a family court case where eventually, after numerous hearings, Dmitry was stripped of his parental rights. And some people had commented, why was it so difficult? But stripping someone of parental rights in any country is actually quite difficult. There are people in prison for unrelated offenses, let's say in the United States and Canada, that have not been stripped of their parental rights and are able to see their children. So there has to be some really serious stuff going on, such as ongoing long-term physical documented abuse of the children. So the fact that he was stripped of parental rights sounds crazy, that it's taken multiple hearings, but it's actually not surprising because that's kind of how the legal practice goes in many different countries, including progressive countries. And during those hearings, he would repeatedly refer to himself as a great father, and I'll comment on why that is important when I look at mental health and personality. As far as the criminal case goes, the prosecutor was trying to get 17 years. Again, as awful as it sounds, because Rita is alive and functional, this was not murder, even though this was attempted murder, and he ended up getting 14 years of hard prison time. The fact that he turned himself into the police, which of course he pre-planned, also counted in his favor. So, I mean, it sounds awful, but I'm not sure what else could have been done because there are those limitations of the legal system and not not just in Russia. So in the course of that investigation, he did have a mental health assessment by the Serbsky Center, which is linked to the Russian Ministry of Health. I have not found the details in the public domain of his particular diagnosis. Multiple media sources refer to the fact that he was diagnosed with one or more personality disorders, but they do not go into detail as to what those disorders are. And of course, he was found to be sane and competent to stand trial. So now let's have a look at his mental health and personality based on available sources. But before I get into it, I'd like to have a brief look at Rita herself. She has been very open about what she's going through, about having to essentially rethink her entire identity as a mother, as a woman with this disability that was caused through extreme bodily harm in an extremely traumatic, unbelievable situation at the hands of what was, once her loved one, the father of her children, the husband. And she says she has not sought the help of any kind of mental health professional, and she seems to believe that either a target of such a horrific attack would go into a deep depression, or the target would fully be functional. And there doesn't seem to be like a kind of a grayscale, a gradation of mental recovery from something that is so awful. And at the same time, she's made comments that make it clear that in addition to dealing with this disability and dealing with her self-perception and just the daily struggles of living in this new way, she clearly has what I would interpret PTSD. She talked about in an interview from about a year ago going for a blood test or to give blood in the context of some new surgery she was having. And she said when she saw the doctor's rubber bands, the tourniquets, she fainted, that she goes into this absolute state of shock. So clearly this particular object is a massive trigger to her. She also talked about the extreme frustration when she cannot do something very basic like open a lid on a Tupperware, how there have been a couple of cases where she would just become aggressive and throw this object because she was unable to open it. So clearly she's very open about sharing this, but it seems like she would really benefit from working in the long term, just navigating this new life with someone who could help her, specifically with PTSD, having been a target of domestic abuse with these lasting lifelong effects. So that is her case. She's actually has already gotten remarried or is getting married in the month of September of 2020. She, I believe, is back to being able to at least drive a car. She's taking care of her children. She has a popular Instagram, which I'll show you and link. So in that regard, she has commented that having a lot of social support broadly in terms of the Russian society and also specifically her friends, colleagues, family has been very helpful. So that is great to hear. But I do believe she would benefit from competent mental health help. And of course, it's much easier for us to comment as outside observers. Now let's have a look at what is wrong with Dmitry. So looking at Dmitry's mental health and personality, the media had contacted neighbors and childhood friends, so you can take that with a grain of salt, he said. She said, however, it is consistent with someone who is pretty disturbed. The neighbors had reported that as a young teenager or preteen teenager, he and his group of friends would engage in the torture of cats, stray cats in the neighborhood. And we know usually that is something that is associated with other traits, with psychopathy, and there are many profiles of well-known, sadly, serial killers that have exhibited that particular trait. Dmitry was also kicked out of his high school and he had to graduate by going to a specialized evening school. So there appears to have been something that perhaps, maybe, was more than just teenage rebellion, perhaps some kind of a conduct disorder. that would be linked with other traits in the long term, pervasive behavior with the antisocial personality disorder, which is also linked to psychopathy. Again, this is based on neighbors' information, so we can take that with a grain of salt, but I think it's important to keep those things in mind. At the same time, he was simultaneously qualified as a nice guy by his social circle. So not Rita's mother, her colleagues, etc., etc. So there was this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing going. He was clearly very good at presenting whatever he wanted to present to a particular audience. He was quite manipulative in that regard, and we know that is associated with multiple cluster B personality disorders or traits thereof, as well as the condition of psychopathy. Another thing that is important to consider here is specifically the not just the jealousy towards hypothetical men and the extreme paranoia that went with it, that Rita reported in multiple interviews, but the envy of any successes that Rita had at the time professionally, this kind of infantile level of envy. He displayed other signs of what would be linked with narcissism, like the silent treatment that I had previously mentioned. And when he did not get his way, he switched tactics and he would go into rages. First it was against inanimate objects, and then that escalated to taking it out on Rita, like the assault that occurred when she announced that she's finally divorcing him, and the escalation to kidnapping. So basically, he could not handle when someone set boundaries or when someone said no. There was no way to cooperate with this man. So I will read to you a translation of an assessment by a Russian psychologist. And this is prior to the psychological diagnosis that the prosecutors had released. So she's basically going by what was said in the media and what she had observed. Her name is Svetlana Boyarinova. Dmitry considers himself a god. He would throw tantrums, demand a great deal of attention. He modified his behavior based on the particular audience, like an actor. He was irritable and aggressive if something went wrong and not the way that he wanted. Dmitry's father served time in prison on manslaughter charges. And also, the father, physically abused his wife, Dmitry's mother. There appear to be serious anger management issues in this family. This is the behavior of an aggressive, demanding child with a low self-esteem. I don't want to sound unsubstantiated, but everything described above is quite reminiscent of the narcissistic personality disorder. This psychotherapist also makes a comment about heredity being important. So let me comment on what I think about her statements. Obviously, I'm a layperson. She's a psychologist, psychotherapist. She's a professional. So first, I too, as a layperson, see a lot of this core narcissism in his behavior, the disproportionate rages, the paranoia, jealousy, and envy at any success that Rita had, the self-centeredness and the sense of entitlement exhibited in multiple types of behavior, where Rita could not even choose the type of bra and underwear she would wear, otherwise she would be accused of having an affair. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable the lengths that this man would go to. The silent treatment, which is one of the telltale signs of narcissism, along with other traits in a pervasive long-term context of interpersonal relationships. So all of that sounds accurate to me. I'm not sure what the psychotherapist means by heredity. If she means pure genetics, then obviously that is a problematic statement, because there are many cases of the children of people convicted for awful crimes, living normal lives, and vice versa, children coming from seemingly well-adjusted families turning out to be absolute monsters. But if what she means by heredity is also the environmental triggers, like the upbringing that Dmitry had with a father who was very aggressive, it's probably not out of the realm of possibility that if the father had been systematically abusive to his mom, he was probably abusive to him as a child. In the very least, it's obviously child abuse for a child to witness this on a long-term basis against one of the parents. So he had no good role models. The mother was a target. She was a weak role model because she was in this abusive marriage with a man who ended up going to prison for manslaughter charges. And none of this bodes well for what Dmitry ended up with as an adult. However, the degree of sadism and enjoyment of that torture situation, screaming what an adrenaline rush. I mean, you cannot make this up in the car as he's taken Rita to the hospital. The level of premeditation, researching how long someone would last with these rubber tourniquets on their hands, pretending like a very good actor that everything is fine and dandy and perfect and getting along and they're going to be good co-parents, that I believe goes beyond a core narcissism. Everything is on the spectrum. That goes into a very different realm. Sadism as a whole, another category. Some of these behaviors, in my opinion, are quite psychopathic. There is such an amazing, in the bad sense, lack of empathy. Going back to what I said, where he would repeatedly refer to himself as a great father in court. The fact that he either could not, or did not want to, or did not care. He did not consider the relationship between a mother and her very young children, where there's not just a very important emotional dependence, there's a physical dependence on the mom. The children are absolutely dependent on that parent and caregiver, specifically the mother. The fact that he didn't care, I mean, it seems like he's smart enough to understand, but he didn't care that there is that relationship, and that when the children grow up and they will realize what daddy had done, that this would be absolutely unfathomable for them, and that would be traumatic in that discovery itself. Is remarkable. It's like he's looking at human beings as automatons that are completely disconnected. There's no relationship between the mom and the children. Therefore, he is a great father. That strikes me as a remarkable lack of empathy, which again is associated in conjunction with multiple other traits in pervasive behaviors over the long term with narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and the linked condition of psychopathy. So unfortunately, like I said, I wish I had access to what the Serbsky Institute said, because these are professionals, but it sounds like this was a pretty serious level of disturbance that he had experienced. So what can we learn from the case of Rita Gracheva? I think this case is a particularly horrifying example of a target who's very proactive, who does everything right, just about everything right within the parameters, the legal, the family, the social parameters of what was possible, and still ends up in this awful situation. And another thing we can learn is that I've shown you multiple photographs of what appear to be a very happy, photogenic, well-adjusted family. So you really never know what's going on behind the scenes. I hope you found this case study useful. Please comment, like, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon, whatever YouTube asks you to do nowadays, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.